Hello. Our story begins with a rumbling in the Chimera's hull as she breached a dense nebula after departing from hyperspace and being released by the pod of Purrgil. The windows immediately sealed shut once their massive tendrils whipped away from the bridge of the ship. The crew of the vessel immediately tried to grab control over the destroyer, but everything was going haywire. The unsanctioned departure into hyperspace destabilized the hyperdrive on the ship, and without it, the reactor was having a miniature meltdown. Despite the members of the crew doing their damage control, the bridge was not safe as a location. Thrawn and Ezra were thrown to opposite sides of the control center upon their exit from hyperspace. Thrawn's bones were broken in many different places, thanks to the Purrgil crushing him during their trip through hyperspace. Ezra's focus on the Force was what kept him in a stationary position until their rude exit from hyperspace. The young Jedi felt his shoulder, the wound still fresh from those rancid death troopers. He turned to look out the windows at the front of the bridge, but the only ones not sealed shut were on the side, next to him, which revealed nothing but the nebula they just exited. Thrawn, on the other side of the room, scrambled to his feet and reached for his blaster, trying to exterminate this foolish child for disrupting their plans. As Thrawn did so, Ezra choked the blaster, rotating it towards the shielded windows, and the trigger fired, without Ezra's own control. The blast ricocheted off the protected viewport and smashed into Thrawn's shoulder. Ezra got to his feet to make an escape, as he gave a slight salute to Thrawn, who had wheeled his attention back over to Ezra. He climbed across the bridge as the doors opened, revealing the stormtroopers and death troopers that had originally clipped him in the back. He threw his hand forward, launching 3 or 4 of them off of their feet, and ignited his lightsaber and jabbed at them, cutting through blaster first until death troopers tried to grab him. He ducked away from their attempts, twisting his saber through their limbs before darting away from the bridge itself. Ezra ran through the corridors, finding many troopers and crewmen displaced by the crude movements to and from hyperspace. The drop was unanticipated for many members of the Chimera's crew. Ezra had to make the best out of the situation as he escaped through the hangar bay of the ship and found himself a TIE interceptor. He flipped the ignition switch on and sped out of the Chimera at maximum speed. These vessels were not well armored, and he was very aware of that. He just knew that he needed to find refuge. He watched the Purrgil, the ones who brought them here, disperse from the Chimera as they made their respective movements into the nebula surrounding the planet they had just reached. Ezra hadn't seen this planetary body before, and had no recollection of a nebula surrounding any of the planets in the galaxy near Lothal. It was possible, but knowing how space whales worked, he naturally assumed that he was sent into a different galaxy. All that mattered now was that he survived. If his friends could save Lothal, and he could separate Thrawn from the Empire, then the rebellion could find victory. He was positive of that much. The TIE interceptor fled from the Chimera, and breached the atmosphere of the unknown planet. Inside the bridge of the capital ship, Thrawn was trying to order crewmen to chase after Bridger, and get the heavy cannons to try and damage the vessel. He wanted to kill Ezra himself, for everything he had just disrupted. As Thrawn very quickly learned, thanks to the officers on deck, they were likely in a different galaxy. Their sensors were scrambled, and everything they could report on was undiagnosable, though Thrawn reasonably believed that they couldn't be in another galaxy. There was no feasible way for the Purrgil to travel that fast through hyperspace, so he was doubtful of the possibilities. On the ground, Ezra, without having been hit by the Imperials, decided to land his ship and move on foot. The bluish-purplish globe was certainly different. His eyes scanned the surface and the ground. The nature was beautiful, never plagued, seemingly by conquest or by Imperial rule. This planet was freed from civilization, which had many benefits. Ezra could sense the deep connection through every living being on this planet. Their souls intermingled with one another, and the feeling, the sensation, could best be described as peace. Ezra smiled to himself before rushing forward. While he had no reason to believe they weren't in another galaxy, this planet felt like it should be considered otherworldly. It was so peaceful, and even in his own life, he had never felt such raw force before. It was like a nexus of life existed within this planet, and it brought him to surreal relaxation. Despite these joyous feelings, he needed to go. His feet carried him across the surface of the planet, and as he got about a click away, he heard the buzzing of TIE fighters and Imperial troop transports. Ezra didn't have a way to see them from his position, but the stormtroopers, led by Corporal Enrock, fanned out, Enrock being the leader because the original captain of the squad had been killed by Ezra. The troopers spread out quickly to scan the area, while the TIE fighters continued to buzz by. Ezra climbed into a tree to rest, because he didn't know how long these Imperials would be searching for him. The only reason he decided on doing this was because there wasn't a ton of tree cover in this area. If he kept going, the TIEs could spot him. At his age of almost 19, he felt like he could take on the entire galaxy, but sometimes it's best to not believe such a thing. Ezra needed to rest as it was. Using the Force to harmonize with the Purrgil for the entire trip was not as easy as it sounded. He only just realized that he made it off the ship because of adrenaline, nothing else, so he was hopeful that this would be the end of the stress for a little bit. He waited patiently for what felt like hours, and while he did, his eyes watered. The thought of never seeing his family again burdened him, and while he could live with the idea of never seeing them again, because he knew that they were okay for the time being, what bothered him most, what shook his heart to the core, was what Hera must have been going through. She was isolating herself following Kanan's death, and it hurt all of them, but he couldn't imagine her pain after losing both Caleb and then himself. That alone broke his heart. He sat in silence as the day continued to evolve on the alien planet, and he watched the vibrant colors shift and change. There was a beautiful vibrancy about this planet, and the tones of colors seemed to transform depending on the time of day. While the surreal beauty was relaxing, the TIE fighters that buzzed by every 20 or so minutes took that peace away from him. Eventually it all stopped, and his exhaustion took over as he fell into a deep sleep. The previous day was brutal, and to act like it wasn't would have been punishment for his mind and body. He believed his plan worked. In his dreams, he repeated the day's events over and again. He saw the last resort being the only option. Thrawn was targeting Lothal citizens, and the Star Destroyers sat over a city burning up. Then the Purrgil came. The flanking Star Destroyers, as well as the fleet above, were decimated. There left Ezra, Thrawn, and the Chimera. When Ezra woke up, he only reaffirmed his belief that he had succeeded. He only hoped that his family was alright. By the time he really got moving, it was the middle of the night. It was a good thing he woke up. As he started to move through the natural beauty of the planet, its quiet illumination was disrupted, again, by the Imperial machine. Stormtroopers had actually been right under Ezra, but everyone knows Imperials never look up. As Ezra escaped away from his napping location, he slipped into a tall grass. In it, he stopped. Despite his cloudy vision rush, he stopped to take in all of it. Sure, the Empire was landing more troopers at his previous location to do another scouting trip, but he had to see this for himself. Ezra lowered himself into the brush. His hands touched his orange outfit. The sleeves were covered in remarkable colors, stemming from the cool color palette. He scanned slowly and took it all in. There was no other way to describe the sensation. It was unreal. The planet was beautiful. As he was surrounded by the tall grass, he felt encompassed by the raw force of the planet itself. Like he and nature were truly connected, and it brought the energy in his spirit to life. He could hear stormtroopers running around behind him, calling out orders and trying to see if they could find the boy, but none of that mattered to Ezra. He was one with the Force, and the Force was with him. In this moment of true beauty, Ezra felt something that pulled his eyes open. There was a small little rodent-like animal, something much smaller than a loth cat, and it tugged at his glove. He nodded his head, as if the animal had said something to him, and he trailed the little animal through the grass until they climbed up a small ledge, and into a cave, where he could see the stormtroopers from the viewpoint. What Ezra didn't know about the surface of this planet were the transformations that occurred in different areas at varying times of day and night. Ezra could then hear screams from the troopers. The grass that had embraced Ezra wasn't just a kind and compassionate breath from the planet itself, but also the beginning of its feeding time. The grass may have been plants, but that didn't mean that harvesting off of unwanted visitors wasn't within their reach. Unbeknownst to Ezra, the Imperials had found his footsteps leading into the tall grass. While Enoch was resting after a long day of searching, the next highest in command, a trooper named Havoc, led the troops down into the tall grass to find the boy. Just moments after Bridger left the grass, it consumed them, dragging their screaming and terrified bodies into the dark abyss of not just a sinkhole, but the planet's own body, where they'd be consumed for the benefit of the natural order of the planet. Ezra followed the rodent further into the cave, as he felt the walls and could sense a deeper connection with the Force. The deeper he went, the darker it got, so he eventually ignited his lightsaber to help view everything. The animal and the human walked out into a large opening, and very similar in a manner to Malachor, he could see scars of a battle long gone, a sight that revealed to him that there had been someone here. There had to be sentient life on this planet, and it was likely hostile. Ezra continued forward and stepped around bodies, until, through the bones of a fallen warrior, he saw a glimmering object that caught his attention. He leaned down and looked at the weapon of a Jedi. In the time since the battle, the body must have decayed, revealing this weapon. What Ezra didn't understand was the symbol of the fallen warrior. It didn't belong to a Jedi. It was a circular eye with 4 protruding wings, and he couldn't really figure out what it meant. But he assumed that the Jedi's weapon was left behind because those who didn't survive didn't see the saber under the fallen warrior of a different sect. This left Ezra with more questions than answers. Perhaps they weren't as far away from the galaxy as he initially thought. He and Kanan had a lot of discussions revolving around the Jedi, and through those various conversations, he learned about their history. They were fierce combatants throughout most of it, but their leaning to the light, to the Force, and to the natural order of balance was why they didn't fight every time the opportunity presented itself. As Kanan always said, a Jedi never attacks. They only fight when the calling is of the Force. Ezra's master always believed that fighting the Empire was the right thing to do, even though it once took him time to realize how he could and why he shouldn't. Bridger continued on and on, as Imperial started to litter the ground of their fallen comrades in the tall grass, never finding anything that would tell them where Ezra went. They were very bothered by this too. How could 2 entire squads of troopers vanish, and how could Ezra not be seen as the one to do this? Thrawn was firmly against the supernatural. While he knew it existed and saw it in myriad forms, he also believed it was far too incalculable for him to trust. Those who used it were easy to expose, such as the Jedi. There were others, like the Inquisitors, who were manipulated to use it for another's bidding. But this boy here, the Bridger kid, was a troubling case, even for the brilliant mind of Thrawn. And the simple reason is, despite being a Jedi, he and Kanan didn't exactly play by the Code's rules. Other Jedi might have, which is why they were easy to expose. As Grand Inquisitor said before his death, on numerous times, the Jedi Code is like an itch. The Jedi cannot help what they are. When it came to Bridger and Dejaris, however, their Boken status, especially Ezra's, made them quite difficult to figure out. Their strategy didn't align with traditional wartime strategy. It could only best be compared to the antics of General Skywalker, due to how irregular they could be. Inside the Chimera, they were able to stabilize the reactor again, and begin working on repairs for their sensors and so forth. But the fact that the young Jedi was able to avoid them again left a sickening twist in his stomach. Ezra was a dangerous foe, and because his movements were chaotic or unscripted, then he could do something erratic that could damage their efforts to retreat from this land. Though the issue the Imperial mechanics kept running into was the fact that their sensors weren't fully operational. This was partially in part to the space whales, but also because the nebula was disrupting so many of their mechanics, making everything difficult for them. Thrawn had considered the idea of trying to get out of the nebula, but the engines were badly crippled. Without a viewport on the bridge, low ability to redirect the vessel with bad engines, and faulty sensors, it would be illogical to attempt to free themselves from this prison. Patience was key to winning this battle. Back on the surface of the planet, after several days of cave dwelling and eating off the land, Ezra reached the topside. The food was abundant with fruits and vegetables that were great for healing both Ezra's wound, but also raising his own sensitivity to the planet and his own energy. The young Jedi continued to move about until he came across a massive structure. The little rodent that had been with him for the duration of his travels vanished into a small hole, one that it clearly lived within. It made him question everything for a short moment. Ezra knew he was gifted, but why was that animal days away from its home? The Force works in mysterious ways, Master Windu used to tell Kanan. Perhaps those lessons were correct, and this was another case of mysterious ways. He walked forward towards a temple-like location, built in the shadow of a mountain. The building was certainly an interesting look. In some ways, it looked like a smaller but prestigious version of the Imperial Palace on Coruscant, the one that used to be a Jedi temple. Ezra walked towards it, slowly ascending the steps. He wanted to initially hold his lightsaber, but he felt safe, as if the darkness that had been present had been extinguished or removed. He walked through the open gate and scanned the interior of the temple. Bridger stopped upon his entry and looked at everything in its beauty. He looked for a signature, believing that this had to belong to some ancient religion. No building of such beauty and magnitude was built without having some sort of cultural impact, or impact on the religion in question, right? Ezra closed his eyes, remembering Kanan telling him about Jedi outposts and temples before the war. They were once vast. Quen, Alega, Ashish Ray came to mind. He had visited the last one, but it really wasn't as large as this one. He walked towards the center of the massive chambers and looked up. It was gorgeous. His eyes scanned the walls and he saw nothing, so he ventured deeper into the temple. Ezra was unaware and unsure of what this was, and what it could entail for him, until he found the marker of the Jedi Order. It belonged to the older iteration of said order, because the logo was encrusted with a golden crest, a simple mark in the middle with 4 protruding wings on each side. He placed his hand against it and felt peace fill his body. This temple was special for a reason, and with nowhere else to go, it was up to Ezra to figure out why this location was so important to the Jedi of the past. He believed he needed to work quickly before the Imperials found him, but what he didn't realize is, similar to the wolves of Lothal, the small rodent here had brought him to a location near the other side of the planet. He was nearly as far away from the Imperial scouts as possible, and he would remain that way as long as he needed. With total secrecy, Ezra was able to spend days searching this beautiful location and finding books, holograms, and holograms. As it turned out, the individual who stationed himself at the planet named Tanalorr, hidden behind the Kobo Abyss Nebula, was disgruntled with the Jedi Council. Dag and Gara decided to remain here, and in doing so, he seemingly fell deeper into the dark side of the Force. Bridger was familiar with what such fall from grace felt like, and what it looked like, so he had no intention of following in such footsteps. But what he learned was incredibly important for his own stay here on this planet. Tanalorr wasn't just any regular planet, something Ezra clocked when he first landed. However, due to Bridger's connection to nature and animals themselves, he was able to find a sense of peace here, whereas Dagan was bogged down by the politics of a war and the Council. Ezra, as he read through the documents attached to this location, would be able to ascend in his skills as a Jedi, but in order to have the proper time to do that, he would need to stop Thrawn from leaving. The key to him getting out of here was by sabotaging Thrawn's starship and keeping him grounded. By this point, the Grand Admiral had sent scouts into the nebula to look for a way out. Initially, when individuals came to Tanalorr, the nebula was able to be breached. In the years since Tanalorr had his last visitor, the nebula grew. It wasn't called an abyss for nothing. Out of the scouts Thrawn sent into the nebula, only a few had returned, and none of them had anything substantial to report, meaning that they weren't able to find the exit. The worst part is, the troopers that survived had gotten so close to the other side of the nebula but turned back too early because either the commander slammed into an asteroid or they weren't sure if they'd find their own way back to home base. Though truthfully speaking, it might take a little more to just get out of the nebula. Even though they were struggling immensely, Thrawn felt it important to keep a scout unit on Tanalorr. This included speeders, because they didn't want to waste fuel reserves on TIE fighters flying overhead. It was clear the Bucketheads had a hard time doing their job. Luckily for Ezra, one of these scout troopers happened to find the Jedi Temple. They just weren't able to report it because of him. This gave Ezra time to do some identity theft. By the time the scout trooper found him, it had been about a month since they first arrived at Tanalorr. Ezra couldn't believe what he was learning, and now he was going to ensure he had time to learn everything he needed, and then find his own escape route. Thrawn had an Imperial Lambda shuttle inside the hangar of the Chimera. Ezra almost took it initially, but his gut told him not to, which is why he didn't. Because the Imperials still rightly believed they were in another galaxy, they wouldn't dare use the Lambda shuttle because why would they? It couldn't go galaxy-wide. That meant the fuel was still likely within it. Whenever Ezra was finished the next leg of his training, he would begin his return to the known galaxy. When Scout Trooper Bridger returned to home base, he was able to get his escort back up to the Chimera. The troopers went on shifts, which meant that Ezra had to hang out with stormtroopers for a couple hours. Not as easy as it sounded. He eventually got inside the Chimera again, and due to being the best identity theft in the galaxy, he quickly snuck into the reactor room for the destroyer. He crippled the engines of the Star Destroyer so he could let it sit adrift in space, and then he also used his lightsaber on the hyperdrive, which completely eradicated it. Ezra was once again able to escape, doing the exact same thing. This time they had Thrawn, but that didn't really help either. Instead of allowing the specific fighter to fall into Imperial hands, Ezra landed the ship in the same area, took the tracker out, placed it into a nearby vessel, and then left after cutting down the few troopers who tried to stop him. Bridger was then able to hide away the TIE Interceptor inside of a cave by the Jedi Temple on the other side of the planet. This really pissed Thrawn off, like beyond belief. The Grand Admiral always held himself to high standards, and he entrusted his troops with finding and delivering Ezra to him, and instead, they had simply become a dormant space station. The crew on the Chimera had to work extremely fast too. What Ezra didn't fully realize about this maneuver is that it did two major things. Firstly, it destabilized the thrusters that kept the ship from getting sucked into the gravitational field of the planet, which would lead to a catastrophic death for everyone on board. Secondly, this informed Thrawn that they were in the same galaxy, because why else would Ezra intentionally target the hyperdrive if he didn't know something? As Thrawn put it, Bridger could have stayed inside the Chimera and waited patiently among their ranks until they figured something out, but no, he destroyed their hyperdrive, which left him with the question of why. Thrawn also knew that with so many things going unfavorably, that they needed to do something drastic. Instead of fighting the current, they would go with it. The Grand Admiral suggested that they transform their base of operations, the Chimera, into a space station. If Ezra thought destabilizing their engines or hyperdrive would do them wrong, then he would be mistaken. They would use the Chimera for her abilities, transform any and all remaining parts to build a satellite dish. With confirmation that they were inside the same galaxy, Thrawn was no longer concerned with sending resources to find a way out. He just needed a good enough signal to get to someone. All they needed was time. Ezra on the ground was completely unaware of the tables and how they had turned, because at the end of the day, he may have had a TIE interceptor, but it didn't have a hyperdrive, or the fuel necessary to get to a system that had a fueling depot. So, for the next year, Ezra and Thrawn would be at the opposite ends of a one-way Cold War. Thrawn was more concerned with Ezra than the other way around. Bridger was not concerned at all. He celebrated his birthday on his own, he felt the deaths of billions on his own, and he learned on his own. The power of Tanalorr was why Dagan Gera was originally so interested in the planet, and now Ezra had become very aware of the power he had at his hands. Bridger's own full potential hadn't been tapped yet, but through harmony with the Force, especially after he defeated the darkness by rejecting the Sith holocron with Kanan's help, he was able to reach a new level. Through Force enlightenment, in his own peaceful abode here on Tanalorr inside the Jedi Temple, he felt true success and he thrived. Something Dagan Gera hadn't learned during his time on Tanalorr was how necessary true light was to using the Force. Ezra's own abilities were magnificently increased through the enlightenment he received here. Though this ability in the Force was very passive, it wasn't something Ezra even believed he had done. He just knew when the time was right, and when that time came, he went to leave the planet. Bridger's own move against Thrawn was as exciting as it sounded. He took the TIE Interceptor, loaded it up with the Jedi holocron, the one that he hadn't fully finished yet, and sped through the atmosphere, using the immense speeds of the TIE Interceptor. The Chimera had fully retrofitted into a space station, despite it still holding the look of a regular ISD. Ezra sped towards the Chimera, with the throttle all the way down. Thrawn happened to be sleeping when this happened, and the alarm sounded, rising him from his rest. The deckhands ordered everyone to fire on the Interceptor, not realizing that Bridger wasn't going for the kill. The young Jedi sped into the hangar bay and flipped the engines off of the Interceptor, as its momentum threw it across the hangar. Ezra popped out and landed heavily, as the TIE fighter crashed into dozens of stormtroopers, killing them in the process. He ran to the other side of the hangar bay, cutting off some hyperspace locks that were placed on the shuttle. Thrawn, still only wearing a tank top, rushed to the hangar bay, but he couldn't get through because the doors were blocked by an inferno. He called to the bridge and demanded that they stop Bridger immediately. The Lambda shuttle lifted off. Once Ezra made sure the vessel's hyperdrive was active, he spun through the air and avoided turbo shots made by the Chimera. Ezra knew that they would try and activate the tractor beam, so he was going to try and attempt something that Hera taught him was possible. It was kind of deadly though. Using the hyperdrive, he used a small jump that launched the ship to the edge of the Kobo abyss. When the ship exited hyperspace, it radiated with electricity, as Ezra had to re-jumpstart the engine quickly, because it stalled out. Behind him, TIE fighters started speeding out to chase him. Ezra got the engines on and closed his eyes, allowing the Force to be his guide, giving him a chance to get through the nebula and find his way out of the abyss. Once he exited, the ship launched into hyperspace, leaving the TIE pilots to tread the nebula once more. When Ezra reached a known coordinate, he reached out to General Syndulla's frequency, and told them all that this was Jabba the Hutt and he was in need of a pickup. In the hour following that, he'd be saved by the Ghost, still carrying Zeb, Chopper, Hera, and a new face. The reunion was beautiful, and it made the year-long wait all the more worth it. Of course, Sabine would be informed and she'd have to make her way back to the Rebel command base that General Syndulla was operating out of, which was at Crate. Despite how important the reunion was for Ezra, there were more important factors that could determine the fate of everything. It was the fact that Grand Admiral Thrawn was still alive, and if they sent a Rebel fleet to Tanalorr, they could take down the Imperial officer before he made a grand return. Even though the Rebel Alliance was all for taking the fight to evil, they decided that this move wasn't worth their time. The Rebels made a lot of great decisions, but as seen with their negligence at Lothal, they weren't perfect. This happened to be another case of them not being perfect. The Rebels weren't sitting on any moral high ground by rejecting this information. They simply didn't see him as a threat worthy of their time. It wasn't because they saw Thrawn as incapable, it was the fact that no one knew he was there. The rebels, who frequented the areas around Tanalorr, didn't even know Ezra was there. Chances are the Empire wouldn't ever find Thrawn, so in their minds it wasn't worth sending an attack group to the system. This burdened Ezra a lot, but at the end he was relieved to learn of Lothal's safety, the destruction of the Death Star, the health of his family, and of course, Hera's own mental healing, which came hand in hand with Jacen Syndulla. Away from the wholesomeness, about a month after Ezra escaped, Thrawn was able to get a broken transmission through, which reached an Imperial officer by the name of Gideon, who was able to tread the Koboh Abyss Nebula and save Thrawn and his crew. Unlike Ezra, Thrawn's return to the galaxy would be a burden. He was unbelievably pissed off. His loyalty to the Empire existed because they were in control of the galaxy, the control the galaxy needed. The firm fist to control the outcome of political divides and squabbles, as seen with this rebellion, but he learned what Ezra already had. Instead of following through with the TIE Defenders, Stardust was finalized, and it was destroyed by a single X-Wing fighter craft. Let's say that again. A single X-Wing fighter craft destroyed a moon-sized space station, killing millions in the process, not to mention the fact that Thrawn was made aware of two details that irritated him more. Director Krennic, an individual Thrawn was not friendly with, was killed by Moff Tarkin, openly. The second being the fact that the second Death Star was already under construction for some odd reason. The reason Thrawn was unhappy about Krennic's situation is that Tarkin was Siddi's right-hand Imperial officer. He had influence over so much, and yet he allowed others to openly kill another Imperial officer, one who constructed the very weapon he was killed by. This meant that insubordination ran rampant through the Empire because it was seemingly encouraged by Palpatine, and those most loyal to him. The next issue Thrawn immediately had was the fact that the rebels were able to just secure Lothal. Like sure, a fleet was destroyed there, but the rebels had nothing there. Maybe no one knew that, but at least investigate it. The whole rationale Thrawn had for supporting the Empire was slipping out from under him, and there was absolutely no way that he would ever support the rebellion. Their leaders were fragile of decision-making, because emotion and morals came into play. Thrawn didn't have time for that, and upon his return to Coruscant, he made a decision that would forever impact the direction of the galactic divide. Not even he was sure of this idea, but with many accolades coming his way, the Imperial Senate disbanded, and the Emperor, personally referring to him as Savior of the Empire, he planned to take advantage of it. The irony of his following actions was the fact that he was simply allowing the insubordination that he resented take control over his own actions. However, the only way he would quote-unquote clear it up is by making better of his insubordinate actions. Thrawn, after about a month of his own return, would set a bombing charge inside of Palpatine's mansion, inside the Imperial Palace, and he would be killed in a blast that he didn't predict. As per Thrawn's plan, he showed up himself on site and executed the quote-unquote rebels. Thrawn had freed a bunch of prisoners, dressed them up as rebels, and used them as set dressing and cannon fodder. When the bomb went off, he was at the palace alarmingly fast, and a firefight took place. A couple stormtroopers did die, too bad, and the prisoners were then publicly executed in a battle on live recording, because Thrawn knew the importance of every Imperial seeing him as a hero. During their fight, he rounded his men together and charged in. It was a very patriotic show of force, and the people mostly rallied behind Thrawn, as he broadcasted the entire event live. An image that became widespread the day of the attack was a shot of Thrawn holding Emperor Palpatine in his arms, on the ground. Thrawn and his men dug him out of the rubble and tried to save him. It was through this that power was graciously sent Thrawn's way, but the unraveling of the Empire had already been set in stone. Thrawn, however, didn't care about the revenge tour fellow officers and Moffs would attempt on him. He was concerned with victory, because he had spent a year believing the Empire would toughen up, that they would put the Alliance in his place, and what did they do? Nothing. They allowed the rebellion to walk all over them, and now it was time for them to make their revenge. All the work on the second Death Star was stopped. It was seen as a useless product, and all focus instead went to the TIE Defender program on Coruscant, Kuat, and Corellia. This was intentionally done to make sure the process was done speedily, and across the galaxy, the rebels realized how dearly they had messed up. Ezra's word was true, and they decided to forget about it. This tactical mistake could never be made again. The return of Thrawn also brought some issues for Vader, but the now only Sith Lord in the galaxy had the opportunity to determine his own fate. Instead of playing around with the role of Emperor, he would maintain his station. However, it became clear that he and Thrawn had their own issues with each other. Immediately as Thrawn rose to power, Insubordinate officers were publicly humiliated or killed off by assassins. The Grand Admiral, now Emperor, knew that they would attempt to get his head on a silver platter, and he worked arduously to make sure that never happened. Captain Pellaeon would be instrumental in Thrawn's longevity. This change in Imperial focus also meant that the Empire became much more vicious with its martial law. Planets under Imperial control were absolutely controlled, and systems that escaped Imperial subjugation were soon to come next. Thrawn didn't want to play the little game of who would strike first because he would, and he intended to use the Alliance morality against them. Though something unforeseen that came from this, in the months following its implementation, was the fact that it encouraged rebel sympathizers to rise up and fight back. Thrawn's empire was overbearing and its influence was widespread, but this isn't exactly what the people were willing to deal with. Though something realized by Ezra early on into Thrawn's rule is the same subjugation was not applied to the core. So if they could get the core to turn against the Empire, then perhaps they could influence a changing of the guard from within. He understood how these things worked, for the most part. He was definitely allowing his youthful optimism and energy to get the best of him here. But through his learnings on Tanalorr, he was able to understand the larger picture much more clearly. And because the Alliance had messed up by not trusting his judgment before, Commander Bridger was given command over his own task group of rebel commandos. The war for the galaxy became tense, and it very quickly got worse, especially for the rebellion. It may have had the people's sympathy, but because Thrawn stopped focusing on relics from Tarkin's doctrine and promoting tools to destroy rebel advantage, he started to crush rebel cells with Imperial victory. The one thing consistently overlooked by Palpatine and his advisors was the bigger equals better motto. If they were fighting the Confederacy from the Clone War, sure, bigger battleships, bigger space stations, all cool ideas. But this wasn't a military. It was a ragtag group of rebels trying to pinch, kick, shove, bite, punch wherever they could. They had starfighters and limited cruisers. Focusing on Imperial Star Destroyers was useless. Focusing on starships that could perform raids against Alliance outposts and bases were much more organic and functional, especially if they had advanced pilots. Now, the one thing Thrawn had once again overlooked was Ezra, but this time it wasn't necessarily his fault. The fight between Thrawn and Ezra was one of grit, intelligence, and surprise. Thrawn, as Emperor and Commander-in-Chief of all Imperial military operations, had no concern for Ezra, because he wasn't himself a large enough of a threat to be on his radar. This gave the young Jedi and his commandos an in. They made rapid strikes across the core, but these were not battle tactics. They were influencing people to have their voices heard. It was a showing of the reality of the Mid and Outer Rim, and what Imperial propaganda was hiding from the rest of the people of the galaxy. At first, it didn't work, but slowly, the signs of Imperial occupation of their own core worlds became imminent. The rebels trusted Ezra, but they also saw how unfavorable their operations were becoming. Even with the addition of Admiral Akbar and the Mon Cala fleet, they didn't have any counters for the TIE Defender. It was the perfect counter to the rebellion, but a class war was the key to all of this, and Ezra knew that. Because of the standoffish conflict with the rebellion and Empire, it gave time for everyone to see the cruelty of Palpatine's system, just under the lens of an individual that maintained a harsher status quo. People on the core were the bread and butter of Palpatine's regime, and they remained that way for Thrawn. His greatest concern only remained the unorthodox methods of the rebellion. While Ezra couldn't really use his new powers, he found that the true path of a Jedi was just as Kanan had showed him, through action, through effort, and through compassion. Ezra's impact wasn't as a hero, but as a guide, a leader for lost souls. He called to them, and he spoke to them personally. The rise of the second wave of rebellion came from word of mouth from within the core. For years, leading up to the rise of the Second Rebellion, as it was referred to, came after the Alliance hid itself from the Imperial TIE Defenders. Those vessels were nasty, and the truth is, things started to look really unfavorable for the rebellion. Thrawn tried pushing funding back towards the people, but because Palpatine had done so much damage to the system, it was nearly impossible for Thrawn to do that so easily. So he, after the rebels became less of a threat physically, focused on rebuilding a system of government as to not lose support of the people. Ezra and the rebels realized that this fight needed to be a slow burn, and it very quickly became that. The rebellion fought back with their words, reducing the terms of rebels to liberators, because despite the Alliance still being branded as insurgents, they transformed their style of fighting, whereas the Empire didn't change its approach to fighting off the rebellion. This came because Thrawn's work was no longer in the field. He, by putting the role of Emperor over himself, to keep power away from other officers, was regarded as the hero of the Empire. He was needed for things he didn't care about, often disrupting his own study of rebel tactics, but therein lay another problem for the Grand Admiral. There was nothing for him to study. There were no battle tactics, no art, no nothing, aside from already used symbols of Phoenix Squadron and the Rebellion. This left him with a serious issue. The squeeze of the mid and outer rim eventually drifted to the inner rim and then to the core. But this squeeze didn't stop when the rebels went away. It was unrelenting, because they were trying to force the rebels out of hiding, and they just never came. Rebel work remained discreet, and Ezra's work as a guide made a deep cut across the core. In the year 7 ABY, there hadn't been a true battle for a couple of years. Skirmishes, sure, but a true conflict, no. This led to unforeseen troubles for the Empire. The people of the core rose up. Factory workers, mechanics, governmental positions, independent contractors, military enforcement, all of them stopped paying their dues. They stopped because in the process of trying to reset everything financially for the government, Thrawn realized that Palpatine's empire was sucking the galaxy dry, and Thrawn couldn't just redirect funding that easily, because so much of their funding for the empire went to the military-industrial complex, and taking credits away from that would force layoffs, and without any true conflict, they were just throwing money at a wall to build new vessels, to build new war machines, all for no reason. The martial law that also spanned across the galaxy wasn't as intense as it first started, but it was still very present. And all the while, Ezra's words were inspiring the rise of change. Protests across the Empire, from core to the outer rim, were commonplace. People who worked on Imperial machinery refused to continue. And in the distance, far from the core, the rebellion had been building up their military, so that they, as liberators, could return. They had in their time spent years figuring out the weakness of the TIE Defender, because the Empire only ever created one variant because it was so effective. The greatest threat to this vessel were ion cannons, and every single starfighter in the Rebel Navy were equipped with a toggle to flip between ion and blaster fire. The only reason Thrawn didn't overcorrect for this is because the rebels, after figuring it out, kept it a secret. They didn't act on it. They didn't go out and fight the war. They came back and hid. When the protests became more rampant, the rebels rose up, and they, this time, had the full collective will of the people at their backs. The population was tired of Imperial rule, and it was time for a change, and so they rose to the occasion. Over the years, Vader had been fighting with Luke, Leia, and occasionally Ezra in multiple duels, but he was on the brink of turning. He no longer cared about the Empire, and while the tension with Thrawn was amusing, it wasn't really enough to keep him loyal. He tried finding an apprentice until he found Luke and Leia, but they never would join him. His own return to the light would come, but it would only come with the acceptance from his son. Bridger would remain a focal point in the core, and like a message he had sent out 10 years before, he would inspire the galaxy once again. This time, in his message, his words were more eloquent, his emotions defined by what he had seen, and what change hadn't come with Imperial rule. It was a speech about dreams of a future, where the Empire no longer controlled the galaxy, one where the people had their own choice to live freely again. It was a dream of an era he and many others his age and younger had never had a chance to share in, and it would be through this uplifting voice that Ezra would raise the core against Thrawn. Ironically, the end of the civil conflict between the Liberators and the Empire would not be a large-scale battle. It would not come with Thrawn's defeat. It would come with a changing of the guard. Many Imperials, those who weren't corrupt, couldn't continue to subjugate their families any longer. Thrawn felt immeasurable guilt over his actions, as in his effort to control the galaxy through force, to maintain peace and justice only inspired war. In his shame, he returned to the unknown regions, to allow governance to return, so that he may assist the Chiss with their own military operations against foes who wished illy against them. It was an anticlimactic conflict, and it was wanted that way by the people who suffered the most. They didn't want a drawn-out siege of the core, they wanted change, and they made it. This didn't mean that the end of the Empire didn't come with conflict, but the war wasn't the main reason the Empire slipped away into the history books. Their fall came from pure determination and will. Those who were corrupt tried to have their final stands, but the massive Alliance fleet handled them appropriately. When all was said and done, Ezra would stay with his family. Jason would grow up around Ezra, Sabine, Zeb, Chopper, and most importantly, Hera. The Ghost Crew was a big, happy family, and it always remained that way. There were calls from Lothal for Ezra to return home and lead as a senator, and even go to Coruscant and lead as a new chancellor, but those positions belong to others. Ezra's gift would be the freedom from the Empire. To Luke and Leia, he would gift them the coordinates to Tanalorr, as well as a holocron that he finished learning from. As a true Jedi would, Ezra solved conflict with the Empire without a battle, and it would be through such actions that the transformation of the Empire into the New Republic would be seamless. There would be no Operation Cinder, Necromancer, or Resurrection. There wouldn't be a purge of Mandalore, and the Empire's thin reign on the galaxy slipped away, under the direction of a galaxy focused on a future for all of them, one that would be the beacon of light for generations to come. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to our patrons, General Wells, Darth Maelstrom, Ozpin, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Brood36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jango Fett Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Pure Mark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tib, CC2024, Gallivan Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Granite D-Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Colin Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlinger, The Last Jedi, Apollo, Weewa670, Anakin Stank Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Nox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sense Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. E Gamer, Lord Cali, Youngling Slayer 66, Mammoth Studios, Anakin003, Lord Draken, Fortis Lakes Star Wars, Earbus, Rex the Wolf, Man with 3 First Names, Darkseid46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Giveaway down below, 140k giveaway, go check it out. Patreon giveaway is also on Patreon, go check that out. Otherwise, let's talk about this story. Ezra Thrawn. I really wanted this to feel like a rivalry between the two of them, which is why no one else really comes into the picture. Vader, Luke, Leia, they're all around, but this main conflict, as it starts, as it ends, is between Ezra and Thrawn, and it almost ends anticlimactic, and it's designed to be that way. It's designed to be almost like there's more that could be said, like Ezra and Thrawn could have been friends in another world, in another universe, but they never could be because Thrawn was trying to establish control, and he never realized that the Empire wasn't the control the galaxy needed. I wanted that to be kind of the main message here. It's the vibe of what would happen had Thrawn and Ezra return to the galaxy after the first Death Star was destroyed, and how that would change everything, and how Thrawn would even overreact and even act with vengeance after seeing how Palpatine really controlled the Empire, which was kind of fragile. Anyways, I hope you all enjoyed the story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.